Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on gender and education, and in this session we are going to talk on women education in colonial India. In our previous session also we discussed on the topic in detail, continuing further from the point where we left, and today also we will try to give you elaborative session on the topic women education in colonial India. So this is the second lecture and we believe that you are going to gather utmost information through the session. Friends, for this session we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Webb. Dr. Shruti Webb is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Webb is a prolific professor who continuously and persistently makes efforts so that the student community is benefited through her experiences, through her knowledge. Friends, if you want to ask questions from Dr. Shruti Webb on today's topic, then do call us through toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. All the friends are requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Webb, and let's try to have insight into today's topic. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the lecture.
Hello, Geetika. Thanks a lot for this wonderful opportunity that you have given me once again. So we are going to continue from where I had left in the last lecture. We were basically discussing the various intricacies that were involved in the issue of female education during colonial India. So today I am going to briefly discuss the issue of colonial modernity, because all the changes that the colonial regime in India had initiated as far as the social reforms are concerned, or the education of Indians and particularly women education was concerned, was primarily with the assumption that Indian society was a backward society and it needed a foreign government like the British government to help it come out of its deprivation, its slumber, and to make it treat the path of progress. So therefore this inherent notion that the Britishers carried with themselves was that of the white man's burden, and the very idea that they had been born and brought up in the Western world and their civilization was far more superior than the Indian civilization, than the Oriental civilization, because the Oriental civilization, according to them, was quite unfair and biased towards women. So therefore, they emphatically declared time and again through their various policy statements as well as declarations that Indian society definitely needed foreign rule in order to bring about positive changes in the society and in order to spread education, particularly among the underprivileged sections of society, the marginalized sections of society, and also women. So carrying our discussion further, the idea of modernity went through along with the process of colonialism, and it soon became integral to the whole notion of the nation state. So it was not as if only the colonialists were believers in modernity. Later on, even the nationalists with the certain degrees adopted this entire program. So modernity basically unfolds as a narrative of progress, a break from an irrational tradition and a derived meaning in which we always overcome and surpass that which came before. So basically the whole idea of modernity believes in a break from the past. So completely changing the pattern of thinking and behavior, action and doing as compared to what was being done earlier. So modernity is implemented through science and technology, through more advanced forms of knowledge, development of new social institutions like prisons, hospitals, schools, colleges, factories, etc. and basically a whole new way of mobilizing people. So it was with this mindset that the colonial state embarked on a journey of bringing about piecemeal changes here and there. But then, of course, the idea of modernity was to be implemented with limitations, and it was not the aim was not to completely transform and mobilize Indians in such a way so as to become their own agents of change. So it was a kind of imperfect modernity and imperfect mobilization later on that was adopted as the strategy by the Congress also. Now, coming to the issue of Indian women, how they were being perceived by the British women, by European women who were educated and who had greater rights as compared to Indian women. So, definitely the idea that was being professed was that Indian women were not equal, their status was not equal as compared to the Western women, because they were in the need of a savior, someone who would come from abroad and save them from their downgraded position, and thereby completely ignoring the feminist agency that was very much prevalent in India also. So the British feminists were imbued with an imperialistic consciousness of racial hierarchy, and it was definitely this garb of racial superiority and hierarchy that was instrumental in their taking decisions of coming to India and spreading their messages of reform and education. So the larger belief that was prevalent even among Western feminists was the idea that only the British rule could improve the situation of women in India and could bring about some kind of a positive change. So the Western feminism was largely influenced by the imperial assumptions of the mother country, that is Britain, and colony was conveniently declared as the site of reform, because the colony was politically and economically being dominated by the government, by the colonial government, which again was directly or indirectly pursuing the cause of Great Britain. So therefore, it was very convenient for them to declare their hopes and aspirations, and then having arrived in India, they were also to some extent furthering the cause of the imperial regime. Also, it is important to understand the influence of Victorianism during this period that we are discussing during 19th century, and how Victorianism was not really known for providing equal rights to women. Rather, the colonial policies towards women were based on these Victorian assumptions only, in which females were to be secluded in homes for protection, whereas it was the male members of the society who took the lead in initiating change and bringing about positive outcomes. So the British policy made traditional Indian writings as the reference material for devising various reforms without taking recourse to the logic of modernity, or without taking recourse to a new way of thinking or rationalism. Also, later on, the nationalists refused to allow the British rulers to interfere in the private sphere of family, whose pillar of strength was women. An issue that I would be discussing in near future, because this we would be discussing when we would be talking about this dichotomy between the outside world and the home, that is the private sphere, that is the dichotomy between ghare and baire. Now, coming to the whole issue of how some Western feminists had raised the issue of rights of Indian women, education for Indian women. So it is in this context that one can talk about Mary Carpenter, whose lifespan was from 1807 to 1877. And when she visited India, it was as a role that she played at that time, that of an educational and a social reformer. Now, an account of Mary Carpenter's 6 months in India throws light on the deplorable position of Indian women and their position in society. So she promoted the cause of female education in colonial India. But here the problem was that her emphasis was more on criticism rather than on highlighting the positive achievements of Indian females. Also, the British feminists deliberately robbed Indian women of their own agency, and they kind of portrayed the colonial rule as the most important positive achievement of India over the last 50 to 100 years, which would help Indian women come out of the era of darkness and also try to bring about a change in their own lives. So another reference that can be given in this regard is the work by work titled Mother India by Catherine Mayo, which was published in 1927, which again projected Indian culture as highly exploitative towards women. She argued that it was the moral responsibility of the British rule to protect the minority groups, especially women, and that without the imperial presence, without the presence of the British rule, Indian women would continue to be exploited and their condition would remain as weak and vulnerable as ever. So therefore, time and again, this message that was being conveyed was that Indian women could study, they could have a better life, or their prospects in life could be improved only with the help of the colonial masters through the new kind of legal framework and the new educational policy that must be followed by the colonial rulers. However, if we look at the reality of Western society, it was not completely different or completely contrary to the kind of situation that was prevalent in the Eastern societies. For example, married women even in the Western societies hardly had any legal rights, and they had no female franchise during 19th century, and neither married women had any property rights. Husbands exercised legal power over their wives, and they could even imprison or beat them at their own sweet will. And all this I am talking about the Western society, which also includes the British society. So even the divorce and child custody laws were far more favorable to women rather than to, they were more favorable for men rather than for women. Most occupations did not allow women to join, and even if some occupations allowed both men and women to join in work, there was no concept of equal pay for equal work. So women had to go through this phase of unequal pay for work even in the European countries. Women were not allowed to enter into various professions like medicine, etc., and even law was forbidden as far as women practitioners were concerned. Women were even debarred from higher educational institutions as universities did not allow women students, and on the whole, women were far more dependent on men during 19th century, even in the Western society. So all this talk and discussion and this criticism of Indian society on the basis of the logic that because the condition of women in India was deplorable, they had unequal rights, so therefore British presence was of utmost importance, and it was only through their presence that things could be changed, needs to be seriously questioned, because even the Western society was going through that kind of a phase, and historically this had been the trend that women's rights had been compromised with. Now, coming to the issue of colonial modernity as a gendered issue, as a gendered in its gendered aspect, one can talk about how there was a reconstitution of the domestic space under colonialism, and this was all the more due to a rising emphasis on the dichotomy between the home and the world. So, as a result of this dichotomy, the pre-existing caste, class, familial and gender demarcations were reworked, and in fact the identities were further hardened. So therefore, in due course of the time, when nationalism also started having its influence from 1885 onwards with the formation of Indian National Congress, Indian men also had to counter the idea of British supremacy. So therefore, new modes of patriarchal power were devised from time to time, and this resulted in discovering an ancient golden past, then also further hardening the identities, and also the process of mapping the nation. So therefore, what resulted as a result of this hardening of binaries between the domestic space and the outside space, Indian men declared their inhibition at accepting any kind of reform or change, particularly related to Indian women, and particularly if it was initiated by the colonial masters, because it was considered, particularly from late 19th century onwards, that Indian women belonged to the very sacrosanct and very personal private domain, and it was this private domain that could not be interfered by the Britishers, by the colonial masters, because the colonialism had already established its sway over the political institutions. It was controlling economy, it was controlling trade, and family and the personal sphere was only one domain that was still left untouched, and Indian men did not want any kind of interference, even if this meant that this would bring about a positive change in society, or this would expand educational support system for the population in India. So therefore, the whole issue of female education did not get the kind of support it should have got from the so-called middle class, emerging middle class and Bhadralok in India during the late 19th and beginning of 20th centuries. And even if some beginnings and some initiatives were made for female education, there were many ifs and buts that were attached to it. For example, Lala Hardayal, when he initiated the various educational institutions for women education, there were only particular kind of subjects that were patronized, particularly those subjects that would make women a versatile wife and mother, help them in stitching, embroidery and such subjects, basically related to domesticity. Whereas subjects like geography or pure arithmetics, or for that matter science, were declared as unfeminine subjects, as subjects that were of no use to women folk. So therefore, there was no need of wasting time of women in imparting them that kind of education. So therefore, the whole notion of conservatism remained attached with the idea of female education. Now, we cannot say that this conservatism was found only among Indian males or Indian reformers. This conservatism was also implicit in colonial policies, and even this conservatism can be associated with colonialism, and they also looked at femininity with a prism, and this prism had certain gendered implications. So therefore, one can give various examples to prove this point. For example, the colonial state's reluctance to provide assistance to women who converted to Christianity and asked for state support in fighting social injustice. For example, in 1872, there was a young Hindu girl, Huchi, who got converted. She converted to Christianity, and she expected the colonial state to help her against her husband, with whom she did not want cohabitation. She basically was not interested in moving out with her husband, so therefore she became a convert and asked for the help from the state. But the courts and the missionaries, instead of helping her out or instead of providing support to her in her hour of distress or giving a positive ear to her cries of help, they basically ordered her to go back to her husband, and they even allowed her husband to bring her back forcibly, even though her husband's family was treating her as an outcast because of her conversion. Then, so therefore, there are these kind of examples which show that the colonial state was not all out for helping Indian women in their hours of distress, and their claims of reforming Indian society through education and being at the being behind Indian women in their endeavor to modernize them was more of a rhetoric rather than a reality, because there was definitely a double speak that was going on. Then another example that can be given in this context of colonial conservatism is that most of the reforms that the colonial regime supported Indian reformers for example, abolition of sati or Widow Remarriage Act. So these were not being proposed or introduced as a result of liberal thinking or as a result of rational thinking, that it was irrational and inhuman to kill a living female, to let a female get burnt in the pyre of her husband. So that was not the logic that was offered. The logic was that Indian scriptures, particularly Vedic scriptures, did not allow sati, they did not mention sati, so therefore probably sati could be done away with, because the traditional Hindu law did not have any evidence of sati being performed in early India. So this was the kind of logic that was devised from time to time by the colonial administrators when these new laws were to be introduced. So this again shows that the administrators, the colonial administrators, were not either they were not confident enough, or they did not want to take that kind of a risk of antagonizing native population, and therefore they compromised at so many points, and they were also ready to toe the line of scriptures in order to bring about some kind of piecemeal legislation. Then some other examples that can be given related to native population. For example, Nair men. Nair men, the Nair society was basically a matrilineal society in which women had many rights, and they even had right to property. So, but Nair men, once they got educated and they got employed, they started opposing this matrilineal system of inheritance, as now they wanted that they should be able to pass on their name and their property, their earnings, their wealth to their offsprings, because they were earning handsomely, having got educated, having taken up jobs. So therefore, they demanded a new kind of a marriage law, which came about as a Malabar Marriage Act of 1896, which made some changes in matrilinity. And another change came about in 1933. A new law that was made in 1933 allowed Nair men to pass on their own incomes, their resources to their offspring, and also allowed them to set up conjugal households, and the emergence of a new notion of educated, modern, dominant caste Nair masculinity emerged, thereby weakening the Nair women's claims to landholding privileges. So therefore, the colonial state was hand in glove with the masculinity, with the Indian masculinity claims, and thereby they were even ready to change the a very old traditional system that had been operating in Kerala for so many generations, and thereby this matrilineity was greatly compromised with, and the new law gave greater rights to men as compared to women. So therefore, all this talk that colonial regime was very much interested and very serious about initiating reforms in support of women needs to be understood with certain riders, and one needs to minutely discuss the various inhibitions that were there even among the colonial administrators as far as bringing about such changes were concerned. Now, coming to the issue of reformism and gender. Here also one sees that the social reform movements had a contradictory relations with the gender question. When I say socio-religious reform movements, I basically mean the various reforms that were initiated during the first half of 19th century, like the abolition of sati 1929, then Widow Remarriage Act 1856, etc. And then also during the second half of 19th century, the revivalist movements which started, for example, Arya Samaj, which also championed the cause of female education. The way the first half of 19th century has been described as the phase of liberal reformism. By the end of the 19th century, it was the women agency which had come slightly on its own, and various associations of educated Indian women came to be formed from time to time, and they carried forward the legacy of reform in the realm of female education, health and franchise. However, this women agency became more active and more pronounced and more emphatic during the first half of 20th century, particularly the first 2 decades of 20th century. Now, having discussed these various contours pertaining to reformism and education, I shall be taking a brief break and then I will be rejoining. Thanks.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on women education in colonial India. Dear friends, we believe that you might have gathered maximum of knowledge. We would be meeting again after a very short break. So keep watching us. Hello friends, welcome back in this session where we are discussing on women education in colonial India. We would be discussing on nationalism and women education, as well as would be discussing on regional distribution of educational institutions in colonial India. And for this discussion, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Webb. So we would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Webb, once again. Hello ma'am, welcome back.
Hello, thanks a lot. So we were discussing basically liberal reformism and the reforms that came about during 19th century. Why it is important to discuss these reforms is that they definitely initiated some kind of a change in Indian society, and a new way of thinking and perceiving social change began. Then also this period had a positive influence as far as the issue of women education and women rights were concerned. But again, there were serious limitations that we have just talked about. Now, the agenda of religious and social reform, that is the liberal reformism of the Indian middle classes, was largely proposed within an environment of female seclusion, illiteracy and celibate widowhood. So therefore, it is very important to keep in mind the kind of background that was prevalent at that time, and one needs to look at the socio-political cultural reality of 19th century India when one is talking about reformism and change. And in this whole framework, the issue of child marriage was also very important, because child marriage had been projected as a scriptural and a social necessity due to detrimental effects of educating girls. So it was considered very important that girls should be married off before they enter puberty, because in any case education was considered as more an evil rather than of any use for females in Indian society. Now, both reformism and women's education had to operate within the limits that were imposed by orthodoxy. For example, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, in his effort to stop sati, guaranteed that widows would definitely follow the path of purity even without performing sati. So therefore, it was very important a declaration that was made by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, that in no case he would be supporting immoral widowhood, and it was imperative that they observe a very pure and a pious way of life, and it was only in that condition that he would be an ardent supporter of abolition of sati. So the ideal of purity was entrusted on widows, and this had to be followed even by child widows. So the reason I am telling you all this is to highlight the fact that orthodoxy was very important undercurrent that was playing throughout the first half of 19th century, and it was in that background only that these reforms were also being initiated, and so therefore there were a number of riders also that were associated with them. In Bengal, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, he set up the first schools for girls in Calcutta, and this again was largely a measure to stop women from going haywire, and to particularly for the widows, these kind of educational institutions were considered very important, so that they remain focused and they remain engaged in some kind of a productive activity. And social ostracization as soon followed as a result of establishment of such educational institutions, as literacy was supposed to lead to widowhood. There was a notion that if females would get educated, and particularly if they are educated beyond a point, then no one could stop them from becoming widows. So these were the kind of orthodox ideas that were prevalent in 19th century India, which clearly prevented parents from educating their girls and even from initiating any kind of basic literacy also. It was in this background that Raj Sundari Devi, an upper caste rural housewife, secretly taught herself the alphabets while she was performing her domestic chores. She authored the first autobiography in the Bengali language, which definitely comes very handy for the historians in order to know about the contemporary society and the norms that were prevalent in 19th century Bengal. Then Ramabai Ranade also wrote about the conflict within their homes as their liberal husbands forced them to become literate. So while on the one hand there was this problem of illiteracy, on the other hand there were some husbands who wanted literate wives. So therefore now they were encouraging their wives to become literate, but here also it was more a kind of an enforced something that had been imposed from the top, and not willingly that women were groomed or they were conditioned to take to literacy. So therefore women education came only at the expense of their own wishes, whether they liked it or not. If the husbands wanted, their wives had to be educated, they had to be educated, and that too without exposing them to the outside world, mostly as part of Zenana education. Or even if after getting educated the wife wanted to take up some kind of a vocation or an occupation, that was clearly not allowed. So educated women soon developed a questioning mind, and they soon became critical of their domesticity. For example, Tarabai Shinde and Pandita Ramabai in Western India, and some other examples that can be given in Bengal, Kailash Bhasini Devi. Now, how we can say that such women, they became critical of society and of their families, because the biographies and autobiographies that have been written by these women, they have critiqued the upper caste Hindu households, the upper caste familial bonds and the expectations. And very mockingly and satirically, they have given an account of the kind of lives these women were leading. Educated women were also mocked in folk art, and they were projected as masculine, as homebreakers, and as biologically incapable in bearing and rearing kids. So the reformist husbands and the friends were also projected as meek, weak, and largely feminized. So therefore this proves that the society at large was not ready to accept the image of an educated woman, because an educated woman was hardly considered as a valuable asset for the family. So therefore some of the contemporary paintings, some of the contemporary caricatures, cartoons, etc., they projected educated females in a mocking way, and their husbands were also shown in very negative ways as feminized and weak husbands who were no longer able to tame their wives, because the wives were now educated enough to start questioning and start debating with their husbands. Now this kind of an attitude leads us to the next important theme, and that is the woman's question. By the term woman's question means all the issues that were related to the rights of women, the idea of education of women, the idea of a better status of women in Indian society, the idea that had been initiated in the first half of 19th century, right from the establishment of East India Company's rule in Bengal, that is from 1757 onwards, and later on once they expanded their sway over most parts of the Indian subcontinent, the idea that had been floated was that they were here to transform and to modernize Indian society. But then this modernization and transformation had to come through the agency of women, something that had been claimed by Britishers time and again. But this woman's question largely remained unresolved even during the first half of 20th century. So what was the reason behind this postponement, I would say, of women's question? The women's question was just not getting resolved. It was getting only postponed. So as has been pointed out by Partha Chatterjee, with the growth of the national movement, the women's question came to be combined with the larger political project, and it was put on hold pending the achievement of national objectives. So therefore, from 1885 onwards, the unilateral agenda, particularly with the coming in of Gandhi and with the beginning of mass mobilization, the one-point agenda that became was the ouster of the British rule, an end to the British rule from India, and establishment of an independent India. So unless and until this Purna Swaraj was to be achieved, it was declared that all other divisive forces, all other questions could be postponed. And therefore, the issue of gender, just like the issue of caste conflicts, just like the issue of economic conflicts, just like the issue of rising gap between the rich and poor, so all these issues were conveniently relegated to the background, and they were brushed under the carpet. And the only agenda that was important, that had to be immediately taken up, became the issue of independence of India. So therefore, the issue of rights of women and providing them equal opportunities for educational and employment opportunities, they again started suffering, and there was little headway that could be made. Now, an interesting aspect that one can discuss in this discussion would be the subaltern view. I have already discussed about the subaltern historiography in some of my past lectures when I was doing the series that is Women and History. So I would not be going in detail of subaltern historiography, but I would recommend that those of you who are not able to understand, or you who are finding some kind of a gap, they should kindly revert back and look at those lectures in order to get a clearer understanding of what is subaltern historiography. So the subaltern historians have tried to search for a non-elite perspective for understanding various historical processes. So therefore, the coercive power of colonial modernity and of the reformers has been looked at by various subaltern historians. Then the women's question regarding women in the 19th century was not what women wanted, but rather how to modernize them. This is also an idea that has been floated by the subaltern historians, and it has been validated by giving various examples as to how the whole issue of modernity and female education was not involving any kind of agency of women, though it was about women. but the only unilateral agenda was a superficial kind of a modernization. Then also conformity and marginalization of women's space and culture due to Renaissance, Enlightenment and modernity. This is again an alternative way of looking at history. That is, so far 19th century reform movements had been projected as a grand narrative, as an enlightened phase in modern Indian history, when so many reform movements were introduced and female education became a reality. Women started going to some kind of educational institutions, though in the beginning it was Zenana education, then later on so many educational institutions were started, and how all the evil practices that had been going on, particularly in the eastern part of the country like Bengal, they also began to be questioned, and the colonial state was even passing laws to ban them. So all this was projected as a grand narrative, and even the reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar were projected as the grand reformers of modern India, who had played a very important role in bringing about complete change and role reversal in Indian society. Whereas a closer look at the facts and at the available contemporary literature points out rather to the contrary images that were emerging, and the facts also do not attest to the kind of emulation that has been projected by traditional kind of history writing. And this is the beauty of subaltern historians, that they offer some kind of an alternative understanding and some kind of a revisiting the past. So basically rewriting history. And it is in this context that this whole century of enlightenment, reformism and modernity, that is the first half of 19th century particularly, is being re-questioned by the subaltern historians, and they point out that how what emerged was rather a marginalization of women's space and a further dilution of women's agency. And also a more rigid stance towards the various cultural idioms and ideas and value systems that were already prevalent. So therefore, the point that is being made by the subaltern historians is that there were no significant changes in the existing nexus of gender relations, and this is a very pertinent observation that one must take note of. So on the whole, what emerges is the fact that there was more rhetoric rather than reality, and fact was different from fiction. So the rhetoric of social reform reworked and updated patriarchy in different forms and combined it with an assertion of a homogeneous cultural and political identity, whereby it became important to control women. So now it is very important to emphasize on this homogenization of both the political as well as the cultural identity. So therefore, this homogenization could happen easily and more practically through patriarchy, which again was an age-old practice. So therefore, at no point of time the new reformism or the new kind of educational reforms that had been introduced by even the colonial rulers, they compromised with the idea of patriarchy, patrilineality. These continued to remain the core values of Indian society, the core values of nationalism, and rather these were further strengthened, because now whatever little heterogeneity was, that also came to be questioned, and there was now a whole new notion of nation state that was being strengthened, and this Western notion of the nation state was being replicated by Indian nationalists also, and the nation state was essentially to be rooted in patriarchal ideology and values. The liberal basis of the reformist discourse was also considerably checked when within it the women came to be viewed as a means to rework and recover an inglorious Indian past, and her place in the home came to be celebrated all the more. So therefore, when there was this idea of go back to the past and that India had a glorious past, and when this kind of an ideology was being carried forward, particularly from once Indians got educated, once they started forming their own educational institutions, once they started forming their own political institutions, and from 1885 onwards, when Indian National Congress offered them a platform to kind of raise the political voice against the British rulers, then this kind of framework became all the more important, and a belief in one's own destiny, belief in one's own greatness, belief in India's past, which had been sublimated with the influx of foreigners, with the influx of foreign invasions, with the influx of colonial rulers. This kind of an ideology further relegated women to the home front, further made them prisoners of their past, prisoners of their glorified cultural heritage, and therefore there was now no looking back. And since women came to be associated with the home-bound space, that is the private space, then it became all the more to protect them from the colonial regime, from the interference in the day-to-day lives of the Indian family, and therefore we have reformers and nationalist leaders like Tilak, who refused to accept the Age of Consent Act, and the issue of child bride and child marriage was declared as a national issue, as a cultural issue which had to be protected. The practice had to be protected at all costs. Now this also I won't be discussing here in greater detail because I have already delivered a couple of lectures on this, so I would request the listeners to kindly revert back to these lectures, and so that they can relate to the issue that I am discussing at the moment. Now another important related issue that one needs to talk about is the issue of seclusion. Seclusion and domestication of women, it became a prominent theme in the literature, moral and political treatises, sermons and various law codes also that were devised during 19th century India. So historians often describe this period as a time when the public sphere of politics and work became increasingly male, while the private sphere of home and family became largely female. So therefore, politics, since it was more a male bastion and it referred to more of a public sphere, there was had to be in complete contrast to the private sphere, in which the family and women primarily was the most important epitome of freedom as well as cultural superiority. And this cultural superiority was considered a very important value by Indians, because they were fighting a lone battle against the colonial regime, in which they had already surrendered their political freedom, their economic freedom, and at no cost they were ready to surrender this cultural freedom, which they could continue to experience through the agency of women in the domestic sphere. As has been discussed by Partha Chatterjee, the discourses of nationalism were gendered, and one needs to look with greater, more minuter details to understand this. Nationalism created rather a new kind of patriarchy which fused national integrity with female chastity, that is female purity. Preservation of the home or the nation was embodied in the physical persona of the woman. So therefore, it was out of question to welcome the idea of bringing about too many reforms by the colonial regime, because if all these reforms were going to reform Indian women, then what would remain of the purity, the idealism, the cultural identity that Indian society, that Indian family, that Indian woman stood for. So therefore, Indian nationalists had many inhibitions, and they objected from time to time to the kind of interference that the colonial administrative machinery was initiating in Indian society by introducing a number of reforms, and the best example of this is the Age of Consent Act that had been introduced. Then paradoxically, here one can also talk about Mahatma Gandhi, who greatly appreciated feminine qualities as the epitome of an ideal patriot. Just like women were always gentle, they were always obedient, and they were always, giving in the family. So similarly, Mahatma Gandhi expected the satyagrahis to follow the examples that had been set by women in their homes. So just like women were, never revolting and never becoming violent, they were only accepting what was being handed down to them. So similar kind of a behavior Mahatma Gandhi expected from the satyagrahis, thereby promoting conventional feminine values, norms, and also sacrifices like self-denial, self-sacrifice, and a complete submission to the society. With these few points that I have made, I would like to take a break now till the next discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for giving us an elaborative session on women education in colonial India. Friends, if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. You can see all the lectures pertaining to the series which are there on YouTube, and afterwards, if you feel that you have certain questions to be answered, your questions are welcome at info.cec@nic.in. We would be meeting again soon and would be discussing further. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.
Thanks a lot.